The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. But what happens when something defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? What happens when a man who has stared into the actual abyss, not the metaphorical one that Starfleet captains contemplate over Earl Grey, gets dragged, screaming through a hole in reality and lands in a universe that has no framework for what he is or what he carries with him? The answer, as the crew of the USS Enterprise D discovered on Stardate 44,271.3, is that everything gets complicated very quickly. It began with an anomaly. That was how Lieutenant Commander Data logged it. Because Data logged everything with the same precise neutrality, he brought to cataloging nebulae and crew birthdays, an unpredicted subspace rupture, localized, lasting 0.7 seconds, producing an energy signature that matched no known phenomenon in the Federation database. The rupture appeared 11 meters above the main bridge, between the con and op stations, accompanied by a sound that several crew members later described, independently and with visible discomfort, as screaming. Not mechanical screaming, human screaming, laced with something older. John Constantine landed on the bridge of the Enterprise in a graceless heap, his battered trench coat trailing smoke that smelled of sulfur and cheaper cigarettes. A lit silk cut, somehow still burning between two fingers despite the transit through whatever that had been. He hit the deck, rolled, came up, already scanning the room with the eyes of a man who had learned, through painful and repeated experience, that the first 3 seconds in an unknown location determined whether you had a next 3 seconds. What he saw gave him pause, not fear. Constantine had evacuated fear into a small locked room in his chest years ago, but genuine, professional pause. The bridge was enormous, curved, impossibly clean. Stations glowing with soft blue light. People in matching uniforms frozen in postures of alert confusion. Hands hovering over consoles, eyes wide. Ahead, a view screen filled with stars that didn't match any sky he'd ever memorized. And the air was wrong in a way he couldn't immediately name. Too recycled, too even, carrying no trace of the London damp or the residue of whatever he'd been fighting 20 seconds ago in a condemned flat in Hackney. He took a drag from the cigarette, exhaled slowly. Right? He said to no one in particular. That went badly. Security to the bridge. The voice came from a tall, broad man with a ridged forehead standing near the aft stations, hand already moving towards something at his hip that Constantine clocked as a weapon. Klingon, his mind supplied. Though how a Klingon came to be wearing a Starfleet uniform was a question for later. The man had the look of someone who deeply wanted an excuse. Easy, mate. Constantine raised both hands, cigarette still burning between his fingers. I'm not armed. Well, he reconsidered. Not in any way your scanners will pick up. Whoever you are, you will step away from the con station. The voice from the command chair was measured, authoritative, carrying the specific gravity of someone who had learned to project calm as a professional discipline. Constantine turned. The man seated there was lean, bald, with sharp eyes that were already assessing rather than merely reacting. The eyes of someone who had seen enough impossible things to have developed a methodology for them. Captain. Constantine lowered his hand slightly, recalibrating his approach in real time. Con men and occult operatives shared a core skill: reading rooms. And this room was telling him that bluster would land badly, that the bald man across the bridge would see through it immediately, and that the Klingon would enthusiastically provide the excuse he was looking for. John Constantine, I'd love to explain how I got here, but I'm genuinely not certain myself. And I suspect your sensors are telling you something equally unhelpful. They are. The captain rose from the chair. I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. You will explain what you are, where you came from, and how you breached the security of this vessel. Constantine looked at the cigarette, looked at the immaculate bridge, made a calculation. He took one last drag and then, with the expression of a man making a genuine sacrifice, Field stripped it against his palm and pocketed the remains. I'm from London, he said. Earth, 1990-something, depending on how the timeline's running. He watched Picard's eyes for the flicker of recognition and found something more complicated, not disbelief. but a careful suspension of it. I'm what you might call a specialist in problems your science doesn't have vocabulary for yet. Our sensors detected an energy signature accompanying your arrival consistent with data began from the op station. Don't. Constantine pointed at him without looking over. Whatever conclusion you've reached, it's wrong. Or it's right in the way that calling a hurricane air movement is technically right. He finally looked at the android directly and felt the small, cold recognition he always felt around things that existed outside normal categories. Interesting, he said quietly. You've got no soul. That's not an insult. It's just notable. Data tilted his head. I am an android. I do not possess. I know what you are, Constantine said. I'm saying it like a fact, not a verdict. Picard stepped down from the command level, closing the distance between them. Up close, Constantine revised his assessment upward. The captain wasn't just authoritative. He was genuinely formidable. The kind of man whose certainty had been tested and hadn't broken. Mr. Constantine. Picard's voice was quieter now, intended for the two of them. I have learned not to dismiss what I cannot immediately explain, but I will have answers, and I will have them honestly. Constantine met his eyes, held them, felt, and this surprised him, the urge to actually comply. Honestly, he said, that might be negotiable, but I'll tell you what I can. He became aware, then, of something else. A quality in the air, not the recycled ship smell, but something underneath it. A presence, vast and amused, and very carefully not announcing itself yet. Constantine had spent 30 years learning to feel the weight of entities that were watching. Something was watching now. Something that had, he suspected, been expecting him. He kept his face neutral, filed it away, smiled at Picard. Nice ship, he said. Very clean. Do you have anywhere I could get a drink? If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Picard did not get Constantine a drink. What he got him was a seat in a secured observation lounge. 2 security officers stationed outside the door, and a medical officer named Beverly Crusher who arrived with a tricorder, and the specific professional patience of someone who had learned not to visibly react to the unusual. Constantine sat in the chair like he owned it, which was a habit so deeply ingrained he'd stopped noticing he did it. The observation lounge was extraordinary, a long, curved room with a viewport that stretched the full length of one wall, filled with the slow wheel of stars at warp. He'd been in cathedrals that were less impressive. He'd been in hell dimensions that were more comfortable. You can put the scanner away, he told Crusher. It won't tell you anything useful. It's already telling me several things, she said, not lowering it. Your biology is consistent with human baseline. Early 40s. Slight evidence of what looks like chemical exposure across several organ systems, your lungs. Especially, she looked at him over the device with the expression of a doctor who had opinions about the cigarettes. Elevated cortisol, some unusual neural activity in the temporal lobe that I've never seen before, but which isn't producing any symptoms I can identify. That's the magic, Constantine said pleasantly. It leaves marks. Magic, she repeated. Or call it something else if it helps you sleep. Anomalous psychokinetic energy. Non-standard psionic architecture. Pick a term, and I'll agree with it. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. The point is, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not a shapeshifter. I'm not an alien in a human suit. And whatever your sensors are reading, I'm exactly what I look like. What do you look like? Crusher asked. A man who's had a very long decade. Picard entered then, data behind him. Counselor Troy completing the delegation. Constantine clocked. Troy immediately, the slight difference in how she held herself. The way her attention wasn't landing on his face, but somewhere slightly inside. It. Empath. He dealt with empaths. He dealt with considerably more aggressive varieties than a Starfleet counselor, which was reassuring. Less reassuring was that she was frowning before she'd fully entered the room. Counselor, Picard said quietly. He's telling the truth, Troy said. She was still frowning, working through something. There's something else. An emotional texture I don't have a reference point for. It's not deception. It's more like. She settled on a word that clearly didn't fully satisfy her. Anticipation. And guilt. A great deal of guilt. Occupational hazard, Constantine said. Don't read too deep, love. It gets dark fast. Troy met his eyes and deliberately did not look away. He gave her points for that. Picard sat across from him, placed his hands flat on the table with the deliberate calm of a man setting the terms of an engagement. Mr. Constantine, you claim to be from Earth, 21st century. Our records show no John Constantine in any database we can access, historical, biographical, or otherwise. That's either because my timeline diverged from yours at some point, or because I've been careful, Constantine said. Probably both. He studied Picard. You've dealt with time travel. More than I'd prefer. Then you know that the absence of a record doesn't mean the absence of a person. Constantine unfolded from his casual posture and leaned forward. Because Picard was the kind of man who responded to directness. Here's what I can tell you. I'm an exorcist, a demonologist, a specialist in entities and forces that exist outside your taxonomy of the universe. 6 hours ago, I was in a condemned building in East London performing a binding ritual on something that had been eating the local homeless population. The ritual went wrong. Specifically, the entity I was binding had hitched a ride on something much larger that was using the ritual as a door. He paused. I closed the door from the wrong side, which is why I'm here instead of there. Silence in the observation lounge. The stars wheeled past the viewport. The energy signature that accompanied your arrival, Data said, contained elements consistent with a subspace rupture, but also waveforms that do not correspond to any natural phenomenon in our database. Several waveforms appear to correlate with what Federation science classifies as psionic energy, but at magnitudes and in configurations we have no theoretical model for. That's the most accurate thing anyone's said since I got here. Constantine said, write that down. I am recording this conversation. Course you are. He looked at Picard. I'm not your enemy, Captain. I'm not anyone's enemy right now, which is a refreshingly novel experience. I want to understand where I am, whether I can get back, and what that thing in the subspace waveforms is. He watched. Picard's expression sharpened. You saw it too. Our sensors detected a secondary signature, Picard said carefully, distinct from the rupture itself. It did not follow you through. It didn't need to, Constantine said. It's had a look now. It knows the door exists. He stood, moving to the viewport, and for a moment the mask of casual competence slipped enough to show the machinery. Underneath, the exhaustion, the calculation, the absolute refusal to show fear even when fear was the correct response. Whatever's in your subspace, Captain, it's been there a long time. I could feel it before I came through. Whatever it is, it's not demonic. It's not anything I have a name for. But it noticed me, and things that old don't usually bother to notice people like me unless. There's a reason. He pressed 2 fingers against the viewport glass, barely touching it. His lips moved slightly, not speech, something shorter. A word. Instinctive, nearly unconscious. Picard watched him do it. Said nothing for a moment. Data, he said finally. I want a full analysis of that secondary signature. Cross-reference with every anomalous subspace reading in this sector. For the past decade. Aye, Captain. Picard stood. Mr. Constantine, you'll be assigned quarters. You'll have access to our library computer. You will not access ship systems without authorization. And you will not. He glanced at the faint trace Constantine's fingers had left on the viewport glass, where the air around it seemed slightly different, slightly more settled than the rest of the room. Do whatever that was to any load-bearing part of the ship. Constantine turned from the viewport, smiled. The real one, the one that acknowledged. He was being handled by someone who was actually quite good at it. Fair enough, he said. One question. Yes. That presence you've got watching the ship. He kept his voice conversational. The one that's been here since before I arrived. Powerful. Theatrical. Very. Pleased with itself. He raised an eyebrow. Is that something you've got a name for? Picard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Unfortunately, he said, yes. Hugh materialized on the bridge of the Enterprise the following morning. Ship's time, with the specific timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right dramatic moment and had the patience of an entity that existed outside linear time. He appeared in the command chair, legs crossed, wearing a Starfleet admiral's uniform that he hadn't earned and wore with the casual disrespect of someone who understood that the Uniform was a joke and wanted everyone to know he knew. Picard, he said, in the tone of a man greeting an old and beloved nuisance. You have something new on your ship. I can feel it from 3 sectors away. Like a splinter. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple with theatrical discomfort. A very interesting splinter. Picard turned from the view screen with the expression of a man whose morning had already been long. Hugh, in the flesh. Metaphorically, you know how it is. Hugh uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, scanning the bridge with the attention of someone doing an inventory. Where is he? I know he's here. He smells of something your universe hasn't had in it before. He inhaled demonstratively. Brimstone. Regret. Cheap tobacco. Fascinating. I'll have Mr. Constantine brought to the bridge, Picard said, in the tone of a man making a tactical decision. Oh, don't bother. Hugh snapped his fingers. Constantine appeared beside the command chair, with the precise gracelessness of a man who had been transported against his will from his quarters mid-shave, one half of his jaw still covered in foam. He took in cue the bridge and the situation with the rapid threat assessment scan that had kept him alive for 30 years, and his eyes settled on Q with the specific quality of recognition that wasn't quite surprise. Oh, Constantine said. You. Q's expression shifted, the theatrical amusement sharpening into something that was beneath the performance, genuinely interested. You know what I am. Not specifically, Constantine said, wiping his jaw with the back of his hand. But I know the type. He studied Q the way a jeweler studies a stone, looking for inclusions, for flaws, for the hidden structure beneath the surface. Vastly powerful, operates through games and tests rather than direct action, masks genuine investment in the outcome behind theatrical indifference. He tilted his head. You've met humans before, and you haven't resolved how you feel about them. That's interesting. Things that powerful usually don't bother maintaining ambivalence. The bridge was very quiet. Hugh stood slowly from the command chair, and the quality of his attention changed, the performance dialing down by several degrees. Something more direct underneath. Well, he said, you are different. So I've been told. Constantine didn't step back. What do you want? What do I want? Hugh repeated it like he was tasting the question. He began to pace, hands clasped behind his back, the movement too fluid to be fully human. The Q continuum has observed this universe for longer than your species has had the concept of time. We have tested humanity repeatedly, measured it, argued about it. He paused, turning to look at Constantine directly. We have never encountered a human who arrived in our tests already carrying the residue of realities we cannot fully account for. My universe has things yours doesn't, Constantine said. Clearly, the question is what that means. Hugh moved closer, and Constantine held his ground in the way of someone who had learned that retreating from power was always the wrong call. In your reality, Mr. Constantine, you operate in the space between forces that dwarf human comprehension. You manipulate entities of genuine cosmic significance. You do so not through technology, not through the careful application of scientific principle, but through knowledge, deception, and a willingness to pay costs that most beings refuse. Hugh paused. That is either the most impressive thing a mortal has ever done, or the most appalling. I find myself genuinely uncertain. Join the queue, Constantine said. It's a long one. Hugh smiled, and it was a different smile than the one he usually deployed. Less performance, more actual response. He turned to Picard. I'm going to borrow your guest, Picard. You're going to do nothing of the sort, Picard said flatly. Picard. Hugh. Picard stepped forward. Whatever you're planning. This crew is not your testing ground, and Mr. Constantine is not your instrument. If you have a genuine purpose here, state it plainly. If you don't, leave. Hugh looked at Picard with the particular fond exasperation of someone dealing with a person they respect despite everything. Then he looked at Constantine. He's magnificent, isn't he? Hugh said, completely outmatched by my capabilities, and he still draws lines. It's the most human thing imaginable. He sighed theatrically. Very well. Plainly, he turned to face them both. Mr. Constantine operates on a principle that humanity has debated since it first developed ethics. The idea that good ends justify morally compromised means that you can lie, manipulate, sacrifice, and damn yourself in service of something greater. and that this makes you not a villain, but a necessary one. A hero by outcome, if not by method. Hugh's voice had lost all its theatrical inflation. What remained was something that sounded uncomfortably like genuine inquiry. The continuum wants to know if that's true. Whether a humanity that produces Constantine represents human potential or human failure. Silence. Constantine looked at Q for a long moment. And if I don't want to participate in your little experiment? You don't have a choice, Q said pleasantly. None of us do, really. The trials have already begun. He glanced around the bridge. That secondary energy signature your sensors detected in subspace when Mr. Constantine arrived? It followed the resonance of his presence here. It's been moving. Hugh's tone remained light, conversational. I didn't put it there, in case you were wondering. I noticed it at the same time your sensors did. And I find, rather unusually, that I am not certain what it is. The bridge consoles flickered. Simultaneously. Every screen, every display. For exactly 1 second, showing not their standard readouts, but something else. A pattern, recursive, like a sigil drawn in light. Then normal again. Constantine stared at the blank screen where the pattern had been. His jaw was tight. I've seen that before, he said quietly. Picard and Q both looked at him. Not that exact configuration, but that family of symbol. He exhaled. In my universe. That's what something writes when it wants you to know it's found you. Q clasped his hands together. His expression was, for the first time since his arrival, something approaching cautious. Fascinating, he said, and for once, the word didn't sound like a performance. Hugh's first trial arrived without announcement. One moment Constantine was standing on the bridge of the Enterprise, committing the sigil, pattern to memory with the practiced. I have a man who had built a career on remembering exactly the right detail at exactly the wrong time. The next moment the bridge was gone, replaced by gray stone and the smell of ash and something that took him 3 full seconds to identify as a combination of burning fabric and unwashed fear. He was standing in a street, or what had been a street. The buildings on either side were the low functional architecture of a colony settlement, prefabricated structures, utilitarian, designed for efficiency rather than beauty, and most of them were on fire. The sky above was the particular orange-gray of a world whose atmosphere was doing something it wasn't supposed to. And in the distance, moving through the smoke, were shapes in dark armor that Constantine's pattern recognition filed immediately under soldiers. Occupation, atrocity in progress. Bajorans. He didn't know that yet. Didn't have the word or the context. But he understood what he was looking at. He'd seen occupied territories before. Belfast in the 80s. He'd done a working there that he still didn't entirely like to think about. The visual grammar of oppression was consistent across cultures and apparently across star systems. A child ran past him, and he caught her automatically, steadying her before she fell. She looked up at him with eyes that were doing the thing eyes did when they'd seen too much, the careful blankness that wasn't calm but was the mind's emergency response to an overload of horror. She said something in a language the universal translator in the comm badge Picard had insisted he carry rendered as hide. You have to hide. They're taking people. Constantine looked up. 3 of the armored figures were moving toward them down the street. Their gait the unhurried pace of people who didn't expect resistance. Cardassians, he had the word now, pulled from the Enterprise computer. Files he'd spent his first night reading with the focused speed of a man who understood that information was the only weapon that worked consistently. Military dictatorship. Occupation of Bajorans. Brutal, systematic, ongoing. His first instinct was the same one it always was. Assess available tools. Identify leverage. Find the angle. He had the comm badge, which would do nothing useful here since there was no Enterprise in this sky. Q had been thorough about that. He had his knowledge. He had the attenuated remnants of his abilities in a universe that didn't run on the metaphysical infrastructure his magic required. He had his mouth. Boy, he called out to the Cardassians, stepping away from the child and putting himself between her and them. His voice carried the specific projection of someone who had talked his way past demons, angels, and every variety of supernatural horror and understood that the first rule of bluffing was committing fully. You lot, I've been waiting. Your commanding officer is going to want to see me. Before you process any of these people, I've got information about the Resistance cell that hit your supply depot last week. Names. Locations. The whole thing. The Cardassians stopped. The one in front. Officer's insignia. Constantine noted, looked at him with the careful suspicion of someone who had been lied to professionally and developed a nose for it. Who are you? The officer said. Someone your superiors will be irritated you delayed. Constantine said calmly. You can take me in and find out. Or you can wave me off and explain later why you missed an intelligence asset because you were too busy rounding up civilians. He let the silence sit for exactly the right duration. Your call, mate. The child had slipped away into a doorway while Constantine held their attention. He didn't look after her. Looking was how you told people what mattered. The officer took him in. Not to a superior. There was no superior. Because this was Q's construction, Q's stage. And Q's tests had their own logic. What it was instead was a detention facility. Gray-walled and efficient. And Constantine was put in a cell and left there. And then the real test began. Because they brought others in. Bajorans, men, women, an old man who moved like his bones had opinions about it. A young woman who had the look of someone running on anger because grief was too heavy to carry while moving. They were put in the adjacent cell, and the Cardassian officer came back and sat across from Constantine with a data pad and the professional patience of someone who intended to wait as long as necessary. Names, the officer said. Resistance contacts. Supply routes. You said you had information. And here was the test. Constantine could see its shape clearly. He had no actual information to give. He'd bluffed his way in here to pull one child out of the street. And now he was in a cell. And the people in the adjacent cell were going to be processed, which in the grammar of occupation meant something he didn't want to think about, specifically but understood in general terms. He could give the officer something. Fabricated names. False locations, buying time. He was good at fabricated names and false locations. He could also refuse, which would accomplish nothing except getting him hurt. Or he could do what he actually did, which was look at the officer across the table and begin, quietly and methodically, to take him apart. Not physically, psychologically. Constantine had spent 30 years in the company of entities that fed on human weakness and had learned to map that weakness with the precision of a surgeon. The officer was afraid of his superiors, was tired in the specific way of someone who had been doing something they'd half convinced themselves was necessary for long enough that the conviction was wearing thin, had buried under the armor and the ideology, the ordinary human capacity for shame. Constantine talked to that carefully, precisely, without raising his voice once. 20 minutes later, the officer left the cell door through a sequence of events that would have been difficult to fully explain in an incident report, was no longer locked. Constantine walked to the adjacent cell, worked the mechanism. His hands were steady. They were always steady. It was one of the things he'd trained into himself, and opened it. The Bajorans looked at him. Corridor to the left, he said quietly. There's a shift change in 4 minutes. After that, there's a window of about 90 seconds. He looked at the young woman with the anger instead of grief expression. You've done this before. Led them. She studied him for 1 sharp second. Nodded. They went. Constantine watched them go, then turned back to the corridor, and Q was there, leaning against the wall in his admiral's uniform, and his expression was the most unguarded it had been since his arrival. Not amused, not theatrical, but genuinely, carefully attentive. You gave them nothing, Q said. I gave them a chance, Constantine said. Which is different. You manipulated that officer. Yes. You exploited his psychological vulnerabilities without his knowledge or consent. Yes. And you feel. Q tilted his head, reading something Constantine wasn't broadcasting visibly. Not good about it. Not clean, but certain. That's usually how it goes, Constantine said. He straightened his coat. Is that the test? Whether I'd compromise to save people. Because I could have told you the answer to that without the field trip. No, Q said quietly. The construction around them was already dissolving, the gray walls softening back toward the clean lines of the Enterprise. The test was whether you understood what you'd actually done, what it costs. He paused. Most humans in your position would have told themselves a story about necessity, made it comfortable. You didn't. Constantine looked at him steadily. Comfort's for people who can afford it. Hugh was quiet for a moment that felt, from an omnipotent being, significant. Second trial, he said, will be less straightforward. The Enterprise dropped out of warp at the edge of the neutral zone with the particular reluctance of a ship whose captain had decided to stop moving because stopping was the tactically sound choice. And Picard didn't like it any better for being sound. Constantine had been returned to his quarters following Hugh's first trial, looking like a man who had run a marathon, at a slight psychological deficit, physically unmarked, which was unusual for the kinds of situations his expression suggested he'd been in, but carrying the specific weight of someone who had spent themselves in a currency that didn't replenish quickly. Picard had been told, by Data's analysis and Troy's observation, that the trial had lasted 47 minutes by ship's time, though Constantine had experienced what appeared to be several hours. He had eaten, which Picard took as a positive sign, and then sat in his quarters for 3 hours reading Cardassian political history on a PhD with the focused silence of someone building an architecture of understanding. Picard had let him be. He understood the need to process. What he was less able to ignore was the subspace reading. It had moved again. The secondary signature, the one that had preceded Constantine's arrival, the one that had written itself briefly across every screen on the bridge in a pattern that Constantine had recognized, had been static at the edge of sensor range for 18 hours and then, between one sweep and the next, relocated to a position that put it precisely along the Enterprise's projected course. That was not the behavior of a natural phenomenon. Natural phenomena did not anticipate warp trajectories. It's following us, Data confirmed, with the even delivery he brought to all catastrophic information. Or more precisely, it is positioning itself relative to Mr. Constantine's location. The signature has adjusted its position 3 times, each time maintaining a constant distance of approximately 4 light-years, while remaining directly ahead of our course. Like it's waiting, Worf said. Or hurting, Constantine said from the doorway of the observation lounge, where he'd apparently arrived silently enough that Worf, who did not miss things, hadn't registered his approach. The Klingon security chief turned with the expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of a person upward. Constantine entered the room with the unhurried movement of someone who had learned that entering rooms like you belonged in them was half the battle. 4 light-years is a specific distance, not random. He looked at the sensor display Worf had been studying. In sympathetic magic, which is what we'd call the theoretical framework for what that thing out there appears to be doing, you maintain distance until the conditions are right. You don't approach until your target is already in the configuration you need them in. What configuration would that be? Picard asked. Working on it, Constantine said, which was not an answer but was delivered with enough professional certainty that it functioned as a placeholder for one. It was Troy who noticed the Romulan ship first, or rather, Troy who felt the shift in the emotional atmosphere of the bridge that preceded the sensor alert by approximately 4 seconds, which was enough time for her to say "Captain" in a tone that brought everyone to attention before the console confirmed it. A Romulan warbird, decloaking off the port bow. Deridex class, enormous, predatory. The double-hulled design that always looked to Constantine, when he saw it on the PADD files, like something that had evolved rather than been built. It hung in space with the confidence of a vessel that knew its weapons were already locked. They've been following us, Worf said, with the tone of someone who was angry at himself for not detecting it sooner, which for Worf was a significant emotional disclosure. Romulan vessels have been increasingly active near the neutral zone, Picard said. He was already moving toward the command chair. This is not unexpected. What is unexpected, he looked at Constantine, is that they're hailing us. The view screen resolved into a Romulan face, angular, severe, the controlled expression of someone from a culture that had elevated the concealment of intent into an art form. A woman, mid-ranking by the insignia, though Constantine had already learned enough to know that Romulan rank was frequently decorative. The real power was usually off-screen. Captain Picard, the Romulan said, we have been monitoring an unusual energy signature aboard your vessel. We wish to discuss it. You've decloaked weapons hot in Federation space to have a discussion. Picard said. A precaution. We have reason to believe the energy source is unstable. The Romulan's eyes moved. Briefly, controlled, but Constantine caught it, to the right of Picard's position, toward where Constantine was standing. We would prefer to conduct this conversation in person. We invite you to send a delegation. They know I'm here, Constantine said quietly, not moving. They've been scanning us since before they decloaked. Data confirmed from ops. Focus scans consistent with attempts to isolate an anomalous biosignature. Constantine felt the shape of it with the instinct he'd developed for recognizing. When he'd become a commodity, it was a specific sensation, not quite paranoia, not quite flattery. More like the feeling of being a piece moved on someone else's board. He'd felt it around angels, around the first of the fallen, around every entity that had decided he was useful enough to acquire. The Romulans had been watching since the subspace rupture. They'd had 18 hours to decide what he represented and what to do about it. He looked at Picard. They want me. That would be my assessment, Picard said, his voice carefully neutral. And your prime directive, or whatever principle applies, that doesn't cover handing people over to foreign militaries. Who ask nicely does it? It does not. Good. Constantine straightened his coat. The gesture was becoming, Picard noted, a tell, the physical equivalent of gathering himself before committing to something. Then here's what I think you should do. Decline their invitation. Professionally. Give them nothing to read in the refusal. He paused. And then let me talk to them. Picard looked at him with the expression he'd been developing for Constantine. The one that balanced genuine respect for competence against genuine concern about methodology. On what basis? On the basis that they want me specifically, which means they'll talk to me specifically, which means I can find out what they actually know. Constantine met Picard's eyes steadily. I'm not planning to go over there. I'm planning to have a conversation. I'm very good at conversations. I'm aware, Picard said dryly. They've got information about that thing in subspace, Constantine said, and his voice dropped the performing edge, becoming something more direct. I can feel it in how they're asking. They've seen that signature before, which means they've been watching it longer than we have. And they've got data I need. He paused. Data we need. Picard considered him for a long moment, then turned to the view screen. Open a channel, he said. Constantine stepped forward to stand beside the command chair. And when the Romulan commander's image resolved again, he offered her the expression he used when he wanted someone to underestimate him. Open. Slightly rumpled, mild. Hello, he said pleasantly. I understand you've been looking for me. I'm flattered. I don't usually rate a warbird. The Romulan commander studied him with the careful assessment of someone recalibrating in real time. Mr. Constantine, she said, the Tal Shir has been monitoring the phenomenon that preceded your arrival for 11 years. Constantine kept his expression mild. 11 years. The thing in subspace had been here for 11 years, moving, watching, waiting. He filed that away behind his eyes where it wouldn't show. 11 years, he said conversationally. That's a long time to watch something. Must have made you very nervous. The commander's jaw tightened fractionally. It should make you nervous, she said. We have lost 3 vessels to it. The observation lounge was completely silent. Then we should talk, Constantine said. Properly. No weapons locked. No games. He smiled and let the mildness drop just enough to show the competence underneath. I'm from a universe full of things that eat starships for reasons. I may be able to help. The Romulans did not stand down their weapons. This was, Constantine reflected, consistent with everything he'd read about them, a culture so deeply committed to strategic positioning that even genuine cooperation had to be conducted from behind a defensive posture, because showing good faith openly was, in Romulan philosophy, indistinguishable from showing weakness. He respected that, in the abstract, the way he respected any consistent internal logic even when it made things difficult. What they did do was send a shuttle. 1 officer, no weapons visible, which meant at least 2 weapons not visible. The officer was a woman named Sub-Commander Vela, young for her rank, which meant either genuinely talented or politically connected, and her eyes had the quality of someone who had been doing field work rather than desk work. So Constantine was willing to provisionally accept talented. Picard had the meeting in the observation lounge. Himself, Constantine, Troy, and Data, Worf stationed outside the door. in a way that was technically standard security protocol and was also clearly a message. Vela sat with the controlled posture of someone who had been trained to give away nothing through body language and had practiced until it was second nature. She placed a data chip on the table without preamble. 11 years ago, she said, a Tal shear science vessel operating near the Kavarian expanse detected an anomalous subspace formation, unlike any natural phenomenon in our database. It was not moving at the time of first detection. It appeared, in subsequent months, to be studying our sensor sweeps. Studying them, Picard said, adjusting its electromagnetic profile in response to our scanning frequencies. When we used passive sensors, it remained visible. When we used active scans, it altered the specific wavelengths we were probing to render itself less distinct. Vela's voice was precise, uninflected. It was learning our technology. Constantine looked at the data chip. What happened to the 3 ships? Vela's composure held, but something shifted underneath it. They moved to intercept when the formation began approaching Romulan space. In each case, the vessels experienced simultaneous catastrophic failure of all primary systems. Not weapons fire, not spatial phenomena. The ships simply stopped functioning. Crews were recovered in 2 cases. They were alive. They had no memory of the event. The observation lounge was quiet in the way that rooms got quiet when information landed that reorganized the shape of a problem. No memory at all. Crusher, who had joined them mid-briefing, leaned forward. That's consistent with a specific type of neurological intervention, selective erasure of recent episodic memory. The technology to do that precisely doesn't exist in this quadrant. Apparently it does, Constantine said. He was looking at the viewport rather than the table, running calculations behind his eyes. 3 ships. No casualties, just missing time. It's not destroying things it encounters. It's sampling them. He turned back to Vela. The pattern it wrote across our screens. Your people have seen it before. It wasn't a question. Vela's fractional hesitation confirmed it. We have seen variations of it, she said, always preceding contact events. We have not been able to decode it. I can, Constantine said. The room looked at him. Not all of it, but the family of symbol, the underlying grammar. I know it from my universe. It's old, older than anything that should be in this galaxy. He paused, choosing his next words, with the care he usually reserved for binding agreements with entities that would exploit imprecision. In my reality, there are things that predate the current metaphysical order. Before heaven organized itself, before hell codified its hierarchy, there was something that existed in the space between. Most of it is gone, consumed by the order that replaced it, or driven into corners of reality where the new rules don't fully apply. He looked at Picard. Your subspace is one of those corners. It runs underneath your universe the way certain frequencies run underneath sound, present in the structure of everything, not fully governed by the same physics as the surface. You're suggesting, Data said, with the careful precision of someone who is genuinely working through an idea rather than dismissing it, that an entity from a previous iteration of cosmological order has been resident in subspace, and that your arrival, carrying the resonant signature of a reality more closely aligned with that order, has attracted its attention. I'm suggesting exactly that, Constantine said. And what I don't know yet is whether it's curious, hungry, or trying to communicate. He looked at Vela. The ships had stopped. Where were they going when it intervened? Vela paused. The pause was fractional, but Constantine had built a career on fractional pauses. They were moving to intercept the formation, she said. They were approaching it aggressively. They were following orders. Right. Constantine sat back. So it stopped 3 ships that were moving toward it aggressively, removed their crew's memories of the encounter, and sent them home. That's not predation. That's a warning. He let that sit for a moment. Which means whatever it wants, it's capable of choosing not to destroy things. It's making decisions. Troy had been quiet, through the briefing with the focused silence of someone listening to more than words. There's something you're not saying, she told Constantine quietly. He looked at her. The empathic read was accurate. There was always something he wasn't saying. That was practically a constitutional trait. But he weighed what she'd earned and decided she'd earned this one. The sigil pattern, he said. The grammar underneath it. In my universe, entities that communicate. in that language aren't doing it to be understood by the people they're writing. 2. He kept his voice even. They're doing it to be understood by whatever they think is behind the people they're writing to. They're not talking to us. He paused. They're talking to me. Or more precisely, to what I carry. To the resonance of a reality where they used to have a name. The silence that followed was the kind that reconfigured rooms. Hugh appeared without fanfare. No flash, no theatrical entrance. Simply present between one moment and the next. Standing at the far end of the observation. Lounged with his hands clasped. Behind his back and his expression stripped of its usual performance. He looked at Constantine with something that sat uneasily between respect and concern. The Q continuum, he said without preamble, has been aware of the formation for some time. We classified it as an inert remnant, a fossil of a previous cosmological epoch preserved in subspace. He paused. We may have been incorrect. You didn't know it was active, Constantine said. We knew it had the capacity for activity. We assessed the probability of that capacity being triggered as negligible. Hugh looked at the viewport, where 4 light years away something ancient was waiting. Your arrival appears to have revised that probability considerably. So I woke it up, Constantine said flatly. You reminded it, Hugh said, that the frequency it operates on still exists somewhere, that there is still a reality, where its language is spoken. He turned back to Constantine, and the question in his expression was genuine. The question is what it intends to do about that. Constantine looked at the data chip Vela had placed on the table, looked at Picard, looked at Q, looked at the viewport. I need, he said carefully, to talk to it. That, Q said, is precisely what I'm afraid of. Vela straightened in her chair. The Talshir would consider any attempt to communicate with the formation to be something that's going to happen regardless of what the Talshir considers it. Constantine said, not unkindly. He looked at her steadily. You've lost 3 ships keeping your distance. I'm not suggesting we move toward it. I'm suggesting we answer. He touched the viewport glass with 2 fingers. The same gesture, the same word, and this time left it there for a moment longer. In the right language. The second trial came for Constantine at 0300 ships time, when the Enterprise was running on night shift skeleton. Crew in the corridors had the particular quality of institutional quiet that he associated with hospitals and prisons, places where people tried to maintain normalcy over the top of something that wouldn't stay normal. He was in the ship's library, cross-referencing the Talshir data Vela had provided against everything the Enterprise computer held on subspace phenomena and ancient cosmological theory, which turned out to be considerable. Starfleet science was genuinely impressive when it engaged with questions it didn't have answers to, building elaborate theoretical scaffolding in the absence of facts. He'd been at it for 4 hours and had covered 3 pads and notes, written in a shorthand that mixed standard English with the sigil notation he used for working hypotheses, producing something that looked, he imagined, completely incomprehensible to anyone who tried to read it. Hugh materialized in the chair across from him without announcement. Second trial, Hugh said. Constantine didn't look up from the PADD. I figured that's what this was when. You turned up at 3 in the morning instead of during a dramatic bridge moment. I control time, Hugh said mildly. There are no dramatic bridge moments I couldn't manufacture. And yet, Constantine set the PADD down and looked at Q directly. The omnipotent being looked. In the library's soft light. More contained than usual, less theatrical energy. The performance dialed down to something that might, in a certain light, be called genuine. What is it this time? Hugh gestured, and the library was gone. What replaced it was white. Not the white of a room, but the white of an absence of room. A space that existed as a conceptual placeholder rather than a location. And in that white space, sitting across a table that had no particular reason to be there except that the mind needed something to anchor to, was data. Not the data of the Enterprise, or rather, not only the data of the Enterprise. This data was slightly different in some quality. Constantine couldn't immediately name, sitting with the stillness of the android but without the faint background hum of active processing that data always carried. He looked at Constantine with eyes that were data's eyes, but also somehow representative of something more abstract. Sit down, Mr. Constantine, Q said from somewhere that didn't have a location. This one requires a different kind of attention. Constantine sat, looked at Data who wasn't quite Data. What am I looking at? An opportunity, Q said, to understand something you've never been able to from the inside. A pause. You are going to spend some time as Data. Constantine felt the transition before it happened, a shift in the quality of his own consciousness, like a frequency change, like tuning from one station to another. And then he was looking at his own hands, which were not his hands, which were the precise, articulated hands of an android. And he was sitting across from himself, his own rumpled, slightly exhausted, two-day unshaven self, and the quality of his perception was entirely, fundamentally different. He took inventory the way he always did and found the inventory catastrophically altered. No guilt, not suppressed, not managed, not locked in that small room in his chest, simply absent. The way a frequency is absent when the transmitter is off. The weight he carried, the accumulated ledger of everyone he'd ever burned. Every person he'd ever sacrificed for the greater working gone. Not resolved, not forgiven, simply not present as a felt reality. No hunger, no tiredness, no low-grade physical discomfort of a body that had been run hard for decades. No fear. And this was the one that stopped him. Because Constantine had spent 30 years learning to function through fear, building his operating methodology on the foundation of knowing exactly what he was afraid of and moving toward it anyway. Without fear, there was no courage. There was only calculation. He sat with that for what felt like a long time and was probably seconds. You can access my memories, Hugh said. Data's memories, the full catalog. Every interaction, every observation, every question he's asked about the nature of consciousness and soul and what it means to be alive. Constantine accessed them, felt the strangeness of memory without emotional charge, events, precise and complete, stripped of the feeling tone that made human memory unreliable but also human. He found Data's 3 years of inquiry into the nature of his own existence, found the moment Data had asked Guinan what it felt like to be lonely, and carefully recorded her answer without being able to feel its truth. Found Data playing his violin at 0-200 not from insomnia or need, but from the programmed drive to pursue what he had classified as meaningful activity. Found, buried in the precise chronological record, Data's own version of the question Constantine lived inside. Am I good because I choose good outcomes? Or am I good because I have no capacity to choose otherwise? He thinks about this, Constantine said, heard his voice emerge in Data's precise cadence, felt the strange doubling of that. Constantly, Hugh said, every sentient being eventually arrives at the question of whether their virtue is genuine or structural. Data arrives at it from one direction, wondering if goodness, without the capacity for evil, is really goodness at all. You arrive at it from the other. A pause. You have full capacity for evil. Demonstrated capacity. You've done things that cannot be made comfortable by any ethical framework. And yet, Constantine agreed. Does it feel different? Hugh asked, operating without the guilt. Constantine considered the question with the honesty it deserved, because Q would know if he didn't. Cleaner, he said. More efficient. He paused. Wrong. Wrong how? The guilt is information, Constantine said slowly, working it out as he spoke. It's not punishment. It's the record. It's what tells me the cost was real, that the people I sacrificed were real, that the choices I made mattered. He looked at Data's hands. Without it, I'm just an optimization process. I make correct decisions for correct reasons, and nothing is at stake. He looked across at his own face. Data's problem isn't that he has no soul. It's that he can't feel the weight of his own choices. He knows they matter. He can't feel that they matter. And those aren't the same thing. Hugh was quiet for a moment. He would find that analysis, Hugh said carefully, both accurate and painful. If he could feel pain in the way you mean. I know, Constantine said. That's the tragedy of it. He understands his own condition with perfect clarity, and understanding doesn't help. Does understanding help you? Constantine sat with that question in the white space, in the body of an android, in the absence of guilt and fear and physical discomfort, and gave it the honest answer. No, he said, but it keeps me company. Hugh made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. The white space held them both for another moment. You passed, Hugh said, though past is the wrong word. You answered. What was the question? Whether you'd want to stay? Hugh said simply. Whether the absence of guilt would be a relief you'd choose to keep. A pause. Most beings, given the opportunity to set down what you carry, set it down. Constantine felt the transition back, the weight returning, the inventory resuming. The small locked room in his chest containing everything it always contained. He was in the library again. His own hands. His own pads with their incomprehensible notes. Most beings, he said, haven't thought about what the weight is for. Hugh looked at him across the library table with the expression of someone who was genuinely, unexpectedly moved and was managing it by being very still. Third trial. Hugh said quietly, won't be about you. Constantine picked up his PADD. It never is, he said. That's always when they get difficult. Outside the library viewport, for light years away, the ancient thing in subspace shifted its position for the first time in 6 hours. Moved closer. Not aggressively, incrementally, the way something moves. When it has decided that waiting is no longer the correct approach. Constantine saw it in the sensor readout on his PADD. Made a note. Kept working. Picard found Constantine on the forward observation deck at 0600, sitting on the floor with his back against the viewport and 6 pads arranged in a semicircle in front of him like a working altar, which was not entirely metaphorical. The ancient thing in subspace had moved 3 more times overnight, each repositioning, bringing it closer by increments that suggested calculation rather than urgency, the movement of something that had learned patience across geological timescales and was now, for the first time in a very long while, choosing to spend it. Constantine didn't look up when Picard entered. You're going to tell me it moved again. 2 light years now, Picard said. He stood at the viewport, hands clasped behind his back, looking at stars that looked like any other stars but weren't. At its current rate of approach, it will be within sensor resolution in approximately 14 hours. 11, Constantine said. It's accelerating. Not obviously, the increments are small, enough that the pattern only shows if you map all the repositions together rather than comparing consecutive pairs. He tapped one of the pads. I've been doing that. Picard looked at the PADD. The data was real, sensor readings, position plots. A progression that was indeed accelerating in a way that wasn't visible and simple. Before and after comparison. He sat down on the curved bench that ran below the viewport. Because standing over Constantine, while he sat on the floor, was a power dynamic that served neither of them. And Picard was good at recognizing when formality was counterproductive. Tell me what you know, Picard said. Constantine was quiet for a moment, ordering things. The sigil pattern it used, the grammar underneath it. I've been working through the Talshir data and cross-referencing with what I know from my universe. It's not a complete match, which makes sense, because my universe and yours diverged cosmologically at some point, early enough that the metaphysical infrastructure developed differently. But the root structure is consistent. He picked up one of the pads and handed it to Picard. This is what I think it's saying. Picard looked at the PADD. Constantine had rendered the sigil pattern into a notation system he'd apparently invented for the purpose, part mathematical, part linguistic, annotated in margins with working notes that mixed scholarship and instinct in a way that was either brilliant or delusional. And Picard was provisionally treating as brilliant. The translation, if it was a translation, read. The frequency persists / the frequency persists / where does the frequency originate? / we would speak with the origin. It wants to communicate with your reality, Picard said. It wants to communicate with whatever in my reality. Taught people to use that language. Constantine said, which is not me. I learned it. I didn't invent it. I'm the messenger, not the source. He looked at the viewport. The problem is it doesn't know that. Or it does know and doesn't care. Because I'm the closest available approximation. And if it reaches you expecting a source it doesn't find. That, Constantine said, is the question I've been sitting with since 3 this morning. He picked up another. PDD. Hughes. Trials are connected to this. I don't think he manufactured the situation. I think he's responding to it. Using it. The trials are about whether I'm the kind of person who should be the one talking to this thing, not just the kind of person who can. Picard considered that. And are you? I'm the only option available, Constantine said. which is a different question. It was then that Worf's voice came through the comm badge with the particular, controlled urgency he used when something required immediate response. But he was maintaining professional composure by force of will. Captain, the Romulan warbird has moved to intercept the anomalies projected. Approach vector. They are arming weapons. Picard was on his feet before Worf finished the sentence. The bridge was in the controlled, rapid state of a crew that had been trained for crisis and was implementing that training. Everyone at stations, every console active. The quiet, efficient movement of people doing exactly what they'd been prepared to do. The view screen showed the warbird, enormous and dark, repositioned between the Enterprise and the space, where the ancient thing was approaching from. Subcommander Vela was already on the comm channel, her composure intact, but with something behind it that read, to Constantine, who had followed Picard onto the bridge, as fear being managed by someone very good at managing fear. Captain Picard, she said, the formation is accelerating beyond what our models projected. The Tal Shir's assessment is that it must be intercepted before it reaches inhabited space by firing on something that stopped 3 of your ships without destroying them. Picard said, something that has demonstrated it can neutralize your weapons systems at will. We cannot allow it to reach. You cannot engage it, Constantine said, stepping into the viewscreen's field. He'd made the decision to be visible before he'd fully decided to make it, which was how his best decisions usually happened. Subcommander, listen to me carefully. It's not approaching inhabited space. It's approaching me. And if you fire on it before I've had a chance to answer its communication, you will tell it that this is a hostile universe that responds to contact with violence. And whatever calculation it's currently running about whether to be careful with us will resolve in a direction none of us want. Vela's jaw was tight. You cannot guarantee. I can't guarantee anything, Constantine said. I've never guaranteed anything in my life. I'm telling you what the data says and what 30 years of experience with entities that predate recorded history says. And both of them say the same thing. Do not shoot at this. Picard looked at Vela steadily. Stand down your weapons, Subcommander. I'm asking you as a matter of mutual survival, not diplomatic courtesy. The pause on the Romulan end was 12 seconds, which was long enough to contain an entire internal political negotiation. Then, we will hold position. You have 1 hour, Captain. The channel closed. Picard turned to the bridge. I'll stop. Hold position. He looked at Constantine. You said you needed to answer its communication. How? Constantine looked at the view screen, looked at his hands, looked at the ward he'd pressed into the viewport glass 2 days ago, which was still there, faint, visible only in certain light, but structurally intact in a way that suggested the universe's physics were more flexible than Federation science had previously allowed for. The sigil pattern it projected across your screens, he said. I need to project one back, in the right grammar, something that tells it I receive the message, that I understand what it's looking for, and that I'm not the source, but I'm willing to mediate. He paused. I need to do it through your subspace communication array, which means I need to encode the pattern into a subspace transmission, which means I need an engineer who's willing to do something the manual almost certainly doesn't cover. Picard looked at the con. Get me LaForge. Geordi LaForge arrived from engineering in 4 minutes. Took one look at what Constantine was proposing. Said, oh, that's not going to work with the specific energy of an engineer who meant it would absolutely work once he'd fixed the 17 problems with it, and then bent over a console with Constantine beside him and began dismantling and reconstructing the approach in real time. It took 40 minutes. Constantine's knowledge of sigil construction and LaForge's knowledge of subspace carrier wave modulation turned out to be, improbably, complementary, 2 different languages for manipulating the same underlying reality. One empirical, one experiential, both precise in their own register. They argued 3 times about methodology, agreed twice about the underlying principle, and produced something that neither of them could have built alone. Hugh watched from the aft station, silent, present, wearing an expression that Troy later described as the closest she had ever seen him come to genuine anxiety. Ready, LaForge said finally. Constantine looked at the transmission they'd constructed, looked at the view screen. Where 11 light hours? A way something ancient and patient and enormously powerful was approaching at an accelerating rate. Send it, he said. The transmission went out through the subspace array in a configuration that had never been used before and would never appear in any Starfleet manual. It carried, encoded in the modulation of the carrier wave, a sigil pattern that said, "The frequency persists because it is carried. I am not the origin I am what the origin made I am willing to speak." The ancient thing stopped moving. Complete cessation, instantaneous, at a distance of 9 light hours. Every sensor on the Enterprise registered it simultaneously. The bridge was silent enough that the hum of the ship's systems was individually audible. Then, every console on the bridge displayed the sigil pattern again. But different this time. Longer, more complex. The grammar expanded. Data looked at it for 0.4 seconds. "Mr. Constantine," he said quietly, "I believe it is responding." Constantine stared at the pattern on the screens, translated it in real time with the part of his mind he'd trained for exactly this. The part that had learned dead languages, and older than dead languages, and the notation systems of entities that had stopped using them before humanity developed agriculture. His face changed when he read it. "What does it say?" Picard asked. Constantine looked at him, then at Q. Q's expression confirmed that he'd read it too, and that what he'd read had genuinely surprised him, which was not an easy thing to do to an omnipotent being. "It says," Constantine said carefully, "we have been waiting for someone to answer. We have a message for the one who taught your kind our language. Will you carry it?" The bridge was very, very quiet. "There's a second part," Constantine said. His voice was steady. His hands, at his sides, were not. "The message is about what is coming. What has always been coming. We tried to warn the last universe. They did not listen in time. The ancient thing had a name for itself that didn't translate into any language the universal translator could process. It rendered in Constantine's notation as a frequency rather than a word. A vibration in the subspace carrier wave that data described as mathematically consistent with a standing wave pattern that had been maintaining coherence for approximately 4 billion years. Constantine called it the antecedent because he needed something to call it and because the word was accurate in the way that mattered. It had come before the Federation, before the Klingon Empire, before the Romulan exodus from Vulcan, before the Borg began their consuming expansion through the galaxy, before, apparently, the current cosmological order of this universe had fully settled into its present configuration. The antecedent had been in subspace, the way a fossil is in stone, preserved by the medium, isolated from the surface reality, maintaining the pattern of something that no longer had a context to exist in, until Constantine had arrived carrying the resonant signature of a reality where that context still existed. Picard had called a senior staff meeting, which was the institutional response to a situation that had outgrown individual decision-making, and the senior staff had sat around the observation lounge table and listened to Constantine lay out what he knew with the focused brevity of a man who understood. That thorough explanation was a luxury and time was not. The antecedent's message, as best Constantine could reconstruct it from the sigil transmission, described something that had no clean equivalent in Federation cosmological theory and had several uncomfortable equivalents in the mythology Constantine carried from his own universe: a cyclical phenomenon, a collapse and reconstitution, a fundamental reality operating on timescales so vast that individual civilizations existed entirely within a single phase of the cycle, never living long enough to observe the transition. The antecedent's universe, the previous iteration of this one, the cosmological epoch that had preceded the current order, had ended in exactly this way. They had seen it coming. They had not been believed. The message they wanted Constantine to carry was, in its essential structure, a warning and a set of coordinates. "The coordinates are in subspace," Constantine said, "encoded in a region of subspace that your technology doesn't currently have access to, but which the antecedent says can be reached through a specific modification to your deflector array." He looked at LawForge. "It sent technical specifications with the message. I've given them to Data. I have reviewed them," Data said. "They are consistent with theoretical models of deep subspace access that Starfleet science has been developing for approximately 30 years without achieving practical implementation. The antecedents specifications resolve several outstanding problems in those models. It's giving us technology, Worf said, with the tone of someone who recognized a gift that might be a trap. It's giving us access, Constantine said. There's a difference. The technology is ours to build. The access is to a location in subspace where the antecedents stored a record. Everything they learned. Everything they understood about the cycle and how it works, and what, if anything, can be done about it. He paused. They're not asking us to do anything with it. They're asking us to have it. To know. Why? Troy asked. If they failed to stop it themselves, why does our knowing matter? Because, Constantine said, they didn't fail to stop it. They failed to have enough time to try. He looked at the viewport. We have more time. By their reckoning, the transition, the next collapse, is not imminent. We're in the early phases, which means the record they kept, the knowledge they accumulated, is still actionable. He paused. Possibly. Picard had been listening with the quality of attention he brought to things that required him to hold an enormous amount of uncertainty without resolving it prematurely. Mr. Constantine, you said they wanted you to carry a message to whoever taught your kind their language. Are you prepared to do that? No, Constantine said. For two reasons. First, I don't know how to reach whatever they're referring to, the entities in my universe that originated that language aren't the kind of thing you send a message to. They're the kind of thing you try very hard not to attract the attention of. Second, he stopped, made the decision to say the rest of it. They don't need me to carry the message anymore. I think the message was always the coordinates. I was the medium, not the recipient. They needed someone who could read the grammar to understand what they were saying. The actual message is the record in subspace, and that's reachable without me. Hugh appeared at the end of the table. No theatrics, no entrance, simply present. And when he spoke, his voice had the quality Constantine had heard from him twice before, the quality underneath the performance. The third trial, Hugh said, begins now. Constantine looked at him. I thought the trials were yours. They are, Hugh said. Which is why I can tell you that this one was never about the antecedent, or the subspace record, or the cosmological cycle. He looked at Constantine steadily. It's about what you do with the next 10 minutes. The senior staff looked between them. The Tal Shiar Warbird, Hugh said, has been in communication with the Romulan Senate for the past 3 hours. The Senate has concluded that the subspace record represents a strategic asset of incalculable value and has authorized Subcommander Vela to take whatever action is necessary to secure exclusive Romulan access to it. He paused. They are currently modifying their weapons systems to produce a targeted subspace disruption that will destroy the antecedent's signal coherence, effectively silencing it permanently before it can transmit the coordinates to the Enterprise. The bridge alert came through simultaneously, Worf's voice. Controlled, urgent. Captain, the Romulan Warbird is charging weapons. Configuration I have not seen before. They are targeting the subspace layer, not us. Picard was on his feet. Battle stations. It won't help, Constantine said. He wasn't moving. His voice was even, precise, the voice of someone who had run this kind of calculation before and knew what the variables were. If we engage the Warbird, we're fighting a Deridex class with their weapons already charged and configured. We'll take damage. We might win. We might not. Either way, the antecedents, signal coherence, has a window of approximately 8 minutes before their weapon is ready to fire. That's the actual constraint. Then we have 8 minutes to stop them, Worf said. 7 now, Data said. What would you do? Hugh asked Constantine quietly. Just him, just Constantine. The rest of the room receding slightly in the specific quality of a trials address. Right now? With what you have. What's your move? Constantine stood, straightened his coat, looked at Picard. Get me Vela on comms, he said. Now. Picard nodded once. The channel opened in seconds. Vela's face on the view screen was composed and committed, and entirely closed, the face of someone who had received orders and resolved the internal debate and was now in implementation mode. Mr. Constantine, she said. Step aside. Subcommander, Constantine said. I'm going to tell you something true, and I'm going to tell it to you once. And I need you to actually hear it rather than respond to it. He kept his voice completely level. Whatever your Senate thinks, exclusive access to that record is worth, they're wrong. Not because the record isn't valuable, because exclusive access is impossible. He paused for one beat. The antecedent has been in subspace for 4 billion years. It has already transmitted those coordinates to 17 other locations we haven't identified yet. The signal has been going out since it detected my arrival. Your Senate is about to destroy its own signal coherence window and silence the only entity that can verify and interpret what's already been received by half the quadrant. Vela's composure held, but her eyes moved, the fractional Telheed identified in their first conversation. You're saying, she said carefully, that the record is already distributed. I'm saying that destroying the transmitter doesn't destroy the transmission. Constantine said, what it destroys is your ability to ask the transmitter questions, which is the only advantage anyone in this quadrant currently has. He paused, including the Romulans. 6 minutes had become 4. The Warbird's weapon was still charging. The Senate will not accept. Your Senate, Constantine said, with the precise gentleness of a man delivering something sharp in a soft container, is making a decision based on information that was already outdated when they received it. You know that. You've been in this conversation. You have context they don't. He held her gaze through the view screen. Sub-Commander, what do you actually know is the right call here? The question landed in the space between them and sat there. 3 minutes. Vela looked off screen, said something in Romulan too rapid for the translator to fully parse. But the word for stand down was clear enough. The weapon discharge reading on Worf's console peaked and then decreased. Slowly, the Warbird held position. We will require full access to whatever the Enterprise recovers from the subspace record, Vela said. Her voice was steady and somewhat flat. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was now managing its consequences in real time. That's a conversation for the captain, Constantine said, and stepped back. Picard took it from there. Because Picard was extraordinary at taking things from there, and within 90 seconds had established a framework for joint access that was going to require a great deal of diplomatic follow-up, but was structurally sound. Constantine sat on the edge of the con station and felt, in the specific region of his chest where the weight lived, something that wasn't relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The antecedent's signal coherence was holding. The coordinates were still transmitting. Hugh appeared beside him, quiet, not performing. You didn't manipulate her, Hugh said. No, you told her the truth. It was the truth that worked, Constantine said. That's not always the case. When it is, I prefer it. Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then, the Continuum has been conducting this trial under a specific question. Whether a human who operates through compromise and manipulation represents humanity's shadow or its adaptability. He paused. You've given us a more complicated answer than we were expecting. People usually do, Constantine said, if you ask the right question instead of the one you walked in with. Hugh looked at him with the expression that had been developing across the trials. Something that had started as curiosity and was becoming, Constantine thought, something closer to respect. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that changes the person doing the respecting. The final confrontation, Hugh said quietly, is not with me. Constantine already knew that. He'd known it since the antecedent's second transmission. It's with whatever's inside the record. Yes. And you don't know what that is. Hugh was quiet for exactly long enough to confirm it. No, he said. I don't. The deflector array modification took LaForge 3 hours and 40 minutes, which he described as either a personal record or a professional disaster depending on how it performed, and which produced a reconfiguration so far outside standard Starfleet engineering parameters that the computer flagged it as a potential systems malfunction 17 times. During the process, LaForge overrode it 17 times with the serene confidence of a man who understood what he was building, even if the computer didn't. And when it was done, the Enterprise sat in space with a deflector array that could, in theory, punch a sensor window into a layer of subspace 4 orders of magnitude, deeper than anything Starfleet had previously accessed. In theory, Constantine stood in engineering during the final calibration, not because his presence was technically necessary, but because LaForge had made the thing and Constantine had provided the specifications, and there was a quality of joint investment that made standing somewhere else feel wrong. He'd spent the 3 hours doing what he always did while waiting for something irreversible, running contingencies, mapping failure modes, identifying the points in the process where things could go badly, and what options remained at each point. It was not a calming exercise. It was a professional one. "You doing all right?" LaForge asked, not looking up from the console. "Define all right," Constantine said, not visibly panicking. "Then yes." LaForge smiled at his console. "For what it's worth, the specifications the antecedent sent are elegant. Whoever designed this approach understood subspace at a level we haven't reached yet. The math is clean." He paused. "It's a little terrifying how clean it is. For a billion years to refine it," Constantine said. "You'd hope they got the rough edges off." The array came online at 1,400 hours ship's time, and the first thing it showed them was darkness. Not the darkness of space, which was populated with radiation and particles and the background hum of a universe in constant, energetic motion, but a different quality of darkness, the darkness of a layer of reality that had been sitting undisturbed long enough that the concept of disturbance had become theoretical. Then, as the sensor resolution increased and data began the process of interpreting what the array was receiving, the darkness acquired structure. "It is extensive," Data said, with a quality in his voice that the crew had learned to read as the android equivalent of awe. "The record occupies a subspace volume consistent with a constructed archive, deliberately organized, cross-referenced." He paused. "The information density is, I am having difficulty calculating an accurate figure. It is very large." "How large?" Picard asked. "By preliminary estimate, the archive contains more information than the sum total of all Federation databases currently in existence." Data paused again. "By a factor of approximately 40. The bridge was quiet. "They had 4 billion years," Constantine said. "They were thorough. The antecedent's signal had stabilized when Valus stood down the Warbird's weapon, and in the hours since it had maintained a steady transmission, not the sigil pattern now, but something more complex. A continuous broadcast that Data was beginning to parse as a sequential index. The archive organized itself, apparently, around the question it had been built to answer. What is the cycle? How does it work? And what did we learn?" Constantine sat at the science station Data had configured for him and read. Not all of it. 40 times the sum of Federation. Knowledge was not readable in an afternoon, but the index, the structure, the shape of what had been preserved. The antecedent civilization had been, in its own era, something like what the Federation aspired to be, a coalition of species, exploratory, philosophical, committed to the accumulation of knowledge as an end in itself. They had encountered the signs of the cycle's approach, approximately 2,000 years before its completion, and had spent those 2,000 years trying to understand it. What they had learned was that the cycle was not a catastrophe in the conventional sense. It was a transition, the cosmological order, the specific configuration of physical laws, the particular architecture of space and time, and the forces that governed both, was not permanent. It had a lifespan. At the end of that lifespan, it reorganized, producing a new configuration from the material of the old. Most of what existed in the old order did not survive the transition in any form that could be called survival. Some things did. Could. The archive contained, in its final sections, everything the antecedent had determined about the conditions under which patterns could persist across the transition, could carry themselves through the reorganization and emerge, changed but continuous, on the other side. Constantine read those sections 3 times. The third time, he understood why the antecedent had needed someone from his universe to receive them. The conditions for persistence were not technological. They were not architectural or mathematical or dependent on any particular configuration of matter and energy. They were, in the antecedent's terminology, resonant. They depended on the maintenance of a specific quality of connection between consciousness and the deeper structure of reality. a quality that the antecedents universe had lost in its final centuries. As their civilization became more sophisticated and more removed from the older, less rational modes of understanding that had once maintained it, a quality that Constantine's universe still had, because Constantine's universe still had magic, still had the older languages, still had the unruly, irrational, deeply human capacity to maintain genuine connection with the foundations of reality through means that couldn't be fully systematized. He sat with that for a long time. Hugh materialized beside him quietly, read what was on the screen, and said nothing for several minutes. "You understand what this means?" Hugh said finally. "It wasn't a question. It means the Federation needs what my universe has," Constantine said. "Not the specific technology, not the demons or the angels or the specific metaphysical infrastructure. The underlying capacity, the willingness to engage with reality at a level that isn't fully rational." He paused. "Which is not something you can hand over. It's something that has to be cultivated." The Q continuum, Hugh said carefully, has been debating for some time whether humanity's irrational qualities are a flaw to be corrected or a feature to be preserved. This, he gestured at the screen, suggests the latter rather strongly. "Tell your continuum," Constantine said, "that the things that make humans difficult are the same things that make them durable." He looked at Q directly. "That's what your trials were actually testing, wasn't it? Not whether I'm a good person, whether the messy, compromised, guilt-carrying, rule-breaking version of human is worth keeping." Hugh held his gaze. "Yes. And the continuum's verdict," Hugh said, with the weight of someone delivering something that had been genuinely deliberated, "is that humanity, in all its contradictory, irrational, morally complicated persistence, represents something the universe should be careful not to lose." He paused. "You, specifically, Mr. Constantine, represent that argument at its most difficult to make, and its most impossible to dismiss." Constantine looked at the screen, at the archive of a dead civilization that had tried to leave the lights on for whoever came after. "I need to go home," he said, not with urgency or desperation, with the quiet certainty of someone who has understood what their next task is. "The archive needs interpreters who can bridge your science and the older framework. That's not me alone. I need to bring people from my universe, people who can work with your scientists." He paused. "And I need to go back the way I came, which means reopening the rupture deliberately, which is going to be complicated." "I can facilitate that," Hugh said. "I know you can." Constantine looked at him. "Why didn't you just send me home at the beginning?" Hugh was quiet for a moment. "Because at the beginning," he said, "you hadn't answered the questions yet. And now, Hugh said, I know what to tell the continuum about humanity, and you know what to bring back." He tilted his head. "And the antecedent knows its message was received." Constantine stood, straightened his coat one final time, looked around engineering, at law forges, improbable modifications still humming in the deflector array, at the data stream still flowing from the ancient archive in deep subspace, at the ship that had, in the space of 4 days, become something he recognized as a genuine attempt at the best version of what civilization could be. He found Picard on the bridge. "I need to go," Constantine said. Picard nodded once, slowly. "I know." He paused. "The archive. Data has the index. La Forge has the array configuration. The antecedent signal will hold as long as you maintain the carrier frequency. I've written the specifications into the system." Constantine paused. "The sections on persistence conditions, read them carefully. They're going to require a different kind of thinking than Starfleet usually brings to cosmological problems." "We'll manage," Picard said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had faced the Borg, faced Q, faced the worst the universe could present, and remained, consistently, exactly himself. "Yeah," Constantine said. "I think you will." He looked at the view screen one last time. The stars. The Romulan warbird holding position at a diplomatic distance. The faint sensor reading of the antecedent. Patient and ancient and finally, after 4 billion years, answered. "Q," he said. "Ready when you are." Q said from behind him. Constantine took a breath. "Let it out." "Open the door," he said. The rupture opened with the sound several Enterprise crew members would later describe in their logs as singing, not mechanical, not spatial, but tonal, like A. Frequency finding its resonance after a long search. It lasted for seconds. Constantine walked through it without looking back. Because looking back was how you told the universe you weren't sure. And he was sure. He had been sure since he read the third section of the antecedents. Archive and understood that the message wasn't a warning of inevitable ending but an instruction for continuation. A. Civilization's final gift, offered not to their own survivors, but to whoever came after, whoever proved willing to receive it. The Enterprise held position for 11 minutes after the rupture closed. Sensor arrays still trained on the space where it had been. Picard stood at the viewscreen, in the specific stillness he reserved, for moments that required witness rather than action. Then he turned to his crew and said, quietly, "Back to work." And that was enough. The antecedents signal held. The archive remained accessible. In the months that followed, a joint Federation Romulan scientific commission, unprecedented, contentious, productive, began the long work of interpretation. Data served as primary analyst. LaForge maintained the modified deflector array, which became the basis for an entirely new branch of subspace research. Q appeared occasionally, uninvited and unannounced, to observe and offer commentary that was sometimes useful and always infuriating. In a condemned flat in Hackney, a man in a rumpled trench coat lit a cigarette, looked at the ceiling, and began making notes about what he'd need to bring back with him. The stars, as always, kept their own counsel. Live long and prosper. More stories await.